The views and opinions of this broadcast do not reflect the views and opinions of Armed Media, New Productions and its affiliates. Enjoy the show.
I'm your darkest dream. They call me devil. My heart is empty. They call me devil, and you should be afraid.
This show is based on true events. We may use audio, transcripts, and other media to show the true graphic nature of predators. For legal purposes, this is our research. We are not legal, mental, or medical professionals and do not claim to be. This show is meant to educate and create change in how we deal with predators and the survivors of their abuse. If you or someone else observes someone being abused, please seek help and report it. Some subjects may be disturbing for some individuals. You've been warned. Welcome to Betrayal on Armed Radio every Friday from 10 to 11 p.m. Eastern Time. This show is part memoir and part investigative journey into the dark world of predators and the survivors who lived through it. Welcome to Season 1, our pilot episode of Betrayal. In this episode called Masquerade, the scariest monster are the ones that lurk within our soul. Let's get started.
Edmund Kemper, American serial killer, necrophile, and possible cannibal, talks about his darkest acts. He talks about an evolving passion for damaging things, first non-living objects, then on living animals, before finally targeting humans. At the age of 15, Ed kills his grandparents.
I'm an American, and I went off the deep end saying I'd wanted to kill my mother since I was 8 years old, and I'm not proud of that. It started with surrogates at a non-human level. Physical objects, my possessions, other people's, destruction of things that are cared about, and then destruction of things that are living on a lower level, small animals, insects, animals, and then finally people. It started coming to a head again, so I went back down. I ran away back down there. And then a month later, I'm up living with my grandparents in the mountains, and 10 months later, I murdered them. And it made it worse to be on top of a mountain. I was literally on top of a mountain when it happened. And I sensed everybody in the world just stopping what they were doing, turning around, saw what I did, and are coming to get me. And I knew I was paranoid at that moment. I knew anybody that came up there and gave me a funny look or a fishy eye or quizzical look, I'd have blown their brains out thinking they were coming to get me. And if it had been in a city, I would have been a mass murderer at age 15. I would have killed until they gunned me down. I wouldn't have been able to reason my way out of it. I was scared to death, and I was violent. I felt my back hit that wall. I was the rabbit that always ran, that always backed away, always burned his bridges. And suddenly there weren't any more, and my back hit that wall, and I came out screaming and kicking and shooting. I am an American, and I killed Americans. I am a human being, and I killed human beings. And I did it in my society.
From international best-selling author Kasy Spears and award-winning director Glenn Spillman comes their very first book in the series called Betrayal. Based on a true story, be careful of who you trust. The devil was once an angel too. A must-read for fans of both true crime and first-rate narrative nonfiction. Pandora's Box, a story dirtier than Dirty John, part memoir and part investigation into the world of a narcissistic psychotic sociopath and how they con people and their survivors brave enough to speak out. I know it sounds crazy. It is, but it's also true. Intrigued, you have no idea what is coming. Pandora's Box now available on Amazon and Audible very soon. Don't summon my demons if you aren't ready to play with them. Pandora's Box. Edward Theodore Gein was born to Augusta Crafter and George P. Gein on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. His parents, both natives of Wisconsin, had married on July 7, 1900, and their marriage produced Ed and his older brother Henry G. Gein. George Gein was a violent alcoholic who was frequently unemployed. Ed and his brother rejected their violent, aimless father, as did Augusta. who treated her husband like a nonentity. Despite her deep contempt for her husband, the marriage persisted. Divorce back then was not an option due to the family's religious beliefs. Augusta operated the small family grocery store and eventually purchased a farm on the outskirts of another small town called Plainsville, which became the Gaines family permanent home. Augusta moved to this desolate location to prevent outsiders from influencing her sons. Gaines only left the premises to go to school, and Augusta blocked any attempt he made to pursue friendships. Besides school, he spent most of his time doing chores on the farm. Augusta, who was a fanatical Lutheran, beat into the boys a thought that the world was evil, full of drunks, and that women, excluding herself, were prostitutes and whores. According to Augusta, the only acceptable form of sex was for the purpose of reproduction. She reserved time every afternoon to read to them from the Bible, usually selecting graphic verses from the Old Testament dealing with death, murder, and divine retribution. With a slight growth over one eye and an effeminate demeanor, the young Gaines became a target for bully classmates. Teachers recalled the off-putting mannerisms such as seemingly random laughter, as if he were laughing at his own personal jokes. Despite his poor social development, he did fairly well in school, particularly in reading and studying world economics. By the time his father George died in 1940, Henry had begun to reject Augusta's view of the world. He'd even taken to bad-mouthing her within earshot of the mortified brother. In March 1944, the brothers found themselves in the middle of a brush fire on the property that they owned in the neighboring county. When Anne ran to the police, he told them that he had lost sight of his brother Henry, but led them directly to where his brother's corpse was. Although there was evidence that Henry had suffered from blunt trauma to the head, the local county coroner decided to say it was asphyxiation while fighting the fire. Ben had lived with his mother. Less than 2 years later, on December 29, 1945, Augusta died from a series of strokes, leaving her grief-stricken son alone on the isolated farmstead. Suspected Gaines to be involved in the disappearance of a store clerk, Bernice Wooder, in Plainfield on November 16, 1957. Entering the summer kitchen attached to the house, they saw a carcass hanging from its heels from the rafter. It took some moments before they realized that this was a woman's headless corpse. Local hardware store owner Bernice Wooder shot the 58-year-old widow in her shop, driven her body back to his property where it was undergoing initial preparation to take its place in the macabre collection he had. Searching through the house, the detectives made even more bizarre and shocking discoveries. Chairs made from human skin, skulls turned into bowls, stuffed faces mounted on the wall, a torso tailored into a wearable vest. In addition, they found a box containing female genitalia, a belt made of nipples, a bag of hearts, a pair of lips attached to the light shade as a pull. Most of these horrendous objects were the result of grave robbing rather than murder. After his arrest, though Gaines did admit to another killing, that of a tavern keeper, Mary Hogan, whose body weighed more than 200 pounds, he had calculated would be big enough for a skin suit. Upon entering the shed on his property, they made their first horrific discovery of the night: Warden's corpse. Being decapitated, her headless body hung upside down by the means of a rope at her wrist and a crossbar at her ankles. Most horribly, the body's trunk was empty, the rib cage split, and the body dressed out like it was that of a deer. These mutilations had been performed post-mortem. She had been shot at close range with a .22 caliber rifle. Searching the house, authorities found human skulls mounted upon the corner posts of his bed, human skin fashioned into lampshades and used to upholster chairs and seats, apparently in the use of soup bowls, a human heart. It is disputed where the heart was found. The deputies reported all claims that the heart was in a saucepan on the stove, with some crime scene photographs claiming it was in a paper bag. The head of Mary Hogan, a local tavern owner, found in a paper bag, a ceiling light pull consisting of human lips, a mammary vest crafted from the skin of a woman's torso, a belt made from several human nipples, among other such grisly objects, socks made from human flesh. The most notorious creations were an array of shrunken heads. Various neighborhood children whom Gein occasionally babysat had seen or heard of these objects, which Gein offhandedly described as relics from South Seas, purportedly sent by his cousin, who had served in World War II. Upon investigation, these turned out to be human facial skins, carefully peeled from the cadavers and used by Gein as masks. Gein eventually admitted under questioning that he would dig up graves of recently buried middle-aged women he thought resembled his mother and takes the bodies home, where he tanned their skin to make his macabre possessions. One writer describes Gein's practice of putting on tanned skins of women as an insane transvestite ritual. Gein denied having sex with the bodies he exhumed, explaining they smelled too bad. During interrogation, Gein also admitted to shooting death of Mary Hogan, who had been missing since 1954. Shortly after his mother's death, Gein decided he wanted a sex change, although it is a matter of some debate whether or not he was transsexual. By most accounts, he created his woman's suit so he could pretend to be his mother rather than change his sex. Gein was found mentally incompetent and thus unfit to stand trial at the time of his arrest, and was sent to the Central State Hospital, now the Dodge Correctional Institute, in Waupunkt, Wisconsin. Later, Central State Hospital was converted into a prison. Gein was transferred to Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin in 1968. Gein's doctors determined he was sane enough to stand trial. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity by Judge Robert H. Gullimer and sent for the rest of his life in the hospital. Zenditon was suspected in 1958. Gein's car was used to haul the bodies of the victims, was sold at public auction for a considerable sum back then of $760 to an enterprising carnival sideshow operator named Bunny Gibson. Gibson's called his attraction the Ed Gein Ghoul Car and charged carnival goers 25 cents admission to see it. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory and heart failure due to cancer in Golden Hall at the Mendota Mental Health Institute. His gravesite in Plainfield Cemetery was frequently vandalized over the years. Souvenir seekers would chip off pieces of his gravestone before the bulk of it was stolen in 2000. The gravestone was recovered in 2001 near Seattle and is presently kept in storage. If this sounds like something straight out of a horror movie, well, that's because 3 of them, in fact, were created from this story. The first one, Psycho, from 1960. Before Alfred Hitchcock made Psycho into a movie, it was a very disturbing novel by Robert Bloch. Bloch happened to be living about 35 miles away from Plainfield when Gein was arrested and knew the vague story of what happened. Picking it from the details he had read, and the psychiatrist suspected Gein's clothing made of women's skin was for the purpose of pretending he was a recently deceased mother. Bloch wrote a story about a man obsessed with his mother. When the sordid details of Gein's past came to light, Bloch was surprised at how closely Norman Bates seemed to match. The second one, Silence of the Lambs, 1991. Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill, is actually a terrifying mashup of the least 4 murders from Gein. Gein, Ted Bundy, Gary Hinnick, and Edward Kemp, the woman's suit obviously was inspired by Dean Bundy's lured women into a manner similar to Buffalo Bill's by pretending to be hurt and in need of some help. Henrik fashioned a well-like hole in his basement and kept his women victims. Kemp began his killing spree with his grandparents, as did James Gumb. Lastly, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Many people scoffed at the inspired by true events tag that is accompanied by Toby Hope's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. After all, if a family of miscreants had abducted numerous passerbys and tortured them and had been caught, wouldn't the world have heard about it? Well, it turns out we had. Though there was no character directly inspired by Gein in the movie, some details showed up in the movie that also showed up in Gein's farm. The body part, home decor, and possibly cannibalism, and the mask of skin for starters. According to Harold Schroeder, who wrote the deviant biography of Gein, the murderer who was perfect patient, blissful, calm, and never requiring tranquilizers to keep him under control, and he got along really well with the other patients. Why do you think he felt at home while in confinement? Somebody who was a child in an Arthurian home, Gein's mother, Augusta, who was domineering, had told him that women and sex were evil. May feel it familiar or even compelling to repeat what was essentially a trauma for them. Living under very strict rules, without freedom and being told what to think and what to do is very difficult for children. Some assimilate to the conditions, even though they may be angry about them. Then they replay the childhood trauma as adults and re-participate in the conditions as way of managing the process of the trauma. Essentially, they are drawn to it. In Gein's mind, had Augusta been replaced by this incarceration? His incarceration where people keep him under control and being authoritative, why wouldn't you feel at home? It's been reported that only things that troubled medical staff about Gein was the disconcerting way he stared at the nurses and other female staff. It's hard to tell whether he was consumed by fantasy or obsessive thoughts, or whether he was eroticized by their bodies. We also don't know whether he suffered from depersonalization, a highly aroused and traumatized state where you are almost outside of yourself observing, which sometimes happens to people who have been victims of abuse. A person who looks like nobody's home is how people describe depersonalization, or maybe it was rage or a combination of rage and eroticism, and possibly many other things. Doctors diagnosed Gein with schizophrenia. Based on your knowledge of Gein's life, do you agree with this diagnosis? Obviously, we are looking into a very sick person. However, everything that you have there does not suggest schizophrenia. It describes psychotic episodes. If Augusta had lived longer in life and remained by Gein's side during his lifetime, might it be possible that the killings never existed? It's hard to know the initial pressure building up before her death. It's very possible he had those thoughts long before her death, like most killers and sexual predators do long before their first crime. From international best-selling author Kasy Spears and award-winning director Glenn Spillman comes their very first book in the series called Betrayal. Based on a true story, be careful of who you trust. The devil was once an angel too. A must-read for fans of both true crime and first-rate narrative nonfiction. Pandora's Box, a story dirtier than Dirty John, part memoir and part investigation to the world of a narcissistic psychotic sociopath and how they con people and their survivors brave enough to speak out. I know it sounds crazy. It is, but it's also true. Intrigued, you have no idea what is coming. Pandora's Box now available on Amazon and Audible very soon. Don't summon my demons if you aren't ready to play with them. Pandora's Box.
Born on April 26, 1949, is a Japanese author and reviewer who in 1981, while in Paris, murdered and cannibalized a Dutch woman named Renee Hartenveld. After his release, he became a minor celebrity in Japan and made a living through the public's interest in his crime. Segala wrote books about the murder and even participated in multiple documentaries and interviews, capitalizing on a crime he once committed. Segala's cannibalistic desire started to develop in the first grade, but he didn't act upon these desires until he was 32.
I thought there was no way I could shoot her facing her. Like I said before, I thought it would have to be from her back. And in order for me to aim at her back, she had to be facing away from me. If she reads for me, she sits down at the desk and reads a book. She will have her back to me. I had decided before that the first bite would be the buttocks. I was able to cut through the skin. I'm a fool, so I didn't have a clue about human body structure. I thought that red flesh would appear straight away, but it wasn't like that. And this layer that was like sweet corn just carried on for ages, however deep I cut through. I couldn't reach with my knife, so I ripped out the flesh with my fingers and put it in my mouth. After I had sex with her, I tried to kiss her. For the first time, I said out loud, "I love you" in French, and I felt a huge shiver. Because of my cannibal desire, my personality had seriously become, how do I say it? It was swallowed up by my obsession.
Armin Mewes. One of the creepiest cannibal cases in history, Armin Mewes from Germany, who achieved international notoriety for killing and eating Baron Brandes, found his victim as a volunteer via the internet. After Mewes and the victim jointly attempted to eat the victim's penis, Mewes killed his victim and proceeded to eat large amounts of his flesh. He had found his volunteer on the website called the Cannibal Cafe. Many people responded to his posting, but all backed out, except for Brandes. And they recorded it all on a 2-hour-long video.
Armin Mewes. I was born 1961. I'm computer engineer from Rothenburg, Germany. I killed a man, slaughtered him and ate him. Since then, he is always with me. We've been emailing and chatting on the internet since January, and we talked about exactly what would happen. Bernd had very bizarre ideas and guidelines how he had planned his end. When he actually stepped off the train, I was nervous and excited.
We arrived home, and he went straight into the living room and undressed, so that I could admire dinner, or my dinner, he said.
Oder mein Essen bewundern kann. Sah toll aus.
He looked good. He had a sporty figure, as I'd imagined. He was a very nice, lovely man.
Und
we discussed everything beforehand, including the camera, which should be switched on because he wanted to see for himself what it was like when we did the amputation. Around 6:15 or 6:30 in the evening, he said, "I can't stand it anymore. Cut it off." The second time it happened relatively quickly. It only took a couple of seconds to cut it a few times. Then he gave the most awful yell. But not for long. Only around 20 to 30 seconds. Ow, ow, ow. Then he said, "All I can see is blackness. I have to sit down."
Er
few seconds later, he told me that it didn't hurt anymore. He was astonished, because he'd hoped for more pain.
Mehr Schmerzen davon erhofft. Gesagt, ja, halbier das
He
Teil.
said to me, cut it in half. So I cut it in half with a knife and took both parts downstairs to the kitchen.
Runter in die Küche, die zuzubereiten.
First of all, I washed them and blanched them. It took a few moments for the water to boil. And then I seasoned it with salt, pepper and garlic powder and fried it for a short time. But the meat was so fresh that it shriveled up in the pan and wasn't really edible. I was relatively quick preparing it all, because I thought that because he had such a massive wound, he'd feel faint quite quickly.
Wird relativ schnell ohnmächtig.
But he didn't feel faint, and he tried to eat it, and he was disappointed that he couldn't, that it wasn't edible.
Noch mehr enttäuscht darüber, dass es in dem Zustand auch nicht essbar war. Und dann so gegen
Around 2:30 in the morning, I heard him stumble upstairs.
lag dann zusammen.
He collapsed in front of the bed.
Und
Then he tried to stand up, collapsed again, and didn't regain consciousness. At that moment, I didn't know what to do.
hatten wir nun auch überlegt, soll ich jetzt
I asked myself whether I should pray to the devil or God. And I asked God for forgiveness.
gebeten und hab das Ganze
Then
dann
I took the knife, grasped it in my hand,
in die Hand zu nehmen und
and after hesitating some more, I cut his throat with it.
dann auch zugestochen. Dann habe ich ihn
Then in the slaughter room, after he was dead,
nachdem er tot war,
I separated the head from his body.
Kopf abtrennen, habe ihn dann an der Decke
I hung him from the ceiling.
und
Then I removed his organs and cut him in half. I poured hot water over the two halves and washed the body.
abgebrüht und gewaschen. Das Essen, das hatte ich natürlich dann
I had prepared the meal as a special occasion
vorbereitet, habe
and decorated the table with nice candles.
dekoriert. Dann entsprechend schön
I took out my best dinner service.
an dieses
I fried a piece of rump steak, a piece from his back,
gebraten. So dann
made what are called princess potatoes, and Brussels sprouts.
entsprechend Rosenkohlgemüse. Und dann
Then, after I'd prepared my meal, I ate it.
der erste Bissen war
The first bite was, of course, very strange. It was a feeling I can't really describe.
wahres Gefühl, weil
I'd spent over 40 years, 30 years, longing for it, dreaming about it.
herbeigesehnt und gewünscht. Und
And now I was getting the feeling that I was actually achieving this perfect inner connection
jetzt
through his flesh.
Fleisch perfekt werden. Und das
Flesh tastes like pork,
ähnlich wie Schweinefleisch.
but stronger, more substantial. Although I don't think that other people would have noticed the difference had they eaten it. It tasted really good.
Schmeckt recht gut.
Our next case is still open and unsolved. The man who kept severed vaginas in his freezer. That gives a whole new meaning to the vagina monologues. In this beautiful world we inhabit, how easy is it for us to carry about our seemingly peaceful, simple lives, completely, entirely oblivious to so much going on around us. Good, bad, so many people, so many things, and all of it, many events around us remain completely hidden from our knowledge. Do we turn a blind eye to these things, especially when they're dark, macabre, and depraved? Do we question our abilities to handle them? How do killers and other monsters get away with such horrendous, brutal crimes for so long? In a case you are wondering, no, this is not just another serial killer art. Peter Ferguson committed crimes that strike almost everyone's as utterly unthinkable, especially considering the many other sexual assaults and violations of women's bodies' anatomy coming to light like they do today. Here are some facts from the man who severed women's genitalia from living women and kept them in his freezer. Peter Frankenstein was 63 years old when his crimes finally came to light in 2015. And his tales began in Denmark, where he was born, and would spend the first part of his life. Peter Frankenstein's youth and early adulthood were nothing shy of strange and almost bizarre as the tale is about to unfold. We don't know much about the man who would become the murderer and commit such unthinkable atrocities against women. But we know that he would dabble in dark aspects of Western culture early on in life, namely Satanism. Frankenstein traveled to a small mountain African nation of Lesotho in 2000 and stayed there for several years. In Lesotho, he would eventually meet a woman who would later become his wife and play a pivotal role in the man's twisted story. Peter Frankenstein was convicted of weapon-related offenses in 2006 in his home country of Denmark, but he still managed to obtain all the documentation he needed to run from the law, including proper identification to travel. He ended up settling in South Africa and calling it home. Peter had an avid gun collection and even opened up a gun store in South Africa. Much like Ariel Castro, the monster of Cleveland, Peter Frankenstein was depraved beyond what most of us can even fathom, as would later be brought to light in his trial. He actually married two women, one named Vivian in Denmark and Anna Malestro in Malaysia, Africa, which definitely gives us a bit of insight into his mind and how he viewed women and how unorthodox his lifestyle was up until his arrest. Anna was more than 30 years younger than Peter. Frankenstein was also quite public about his views of female genitalia mutilation, even starting an interview in Danish journalism that was a pseudo-surgeon and had actually mutilated the genitalia of women before. Peter was something of an advocate of the practice, possibly for clandestine religious reasons, including satanic rituals. Frederiksen told the Danish journal that he practiced the procedure not only on his wife, but also on her friends. Peter Frankenstein also claimed he had actually been taught by a doctor in Denmark who went by the nickname Dr. Penis. That man's name was Jorn Egg, and he specialized specifically in penis enlargement surgery, hence the name. He also apparently showed Peter Frankenstein the ropes when it came to the ins and outs of genital mutilation and surgery. Peter Frankenstein was a relentless abuser, especially towards his wife. Records would show that the most brutal of crimes, forced genital mutilation, began in 2010. Some sources state 2004. It's known that his wife Anna placed a phone call to police to alert them that the man's sick and twisted crimes in February of 2014. But the police believed that she was pulling a prank and didn't take her seriously. But it would be in September of 2015 when the police would actually rise But it was September 2015 when the police would actually raise an eyebrow and begin to take Anna's story a bit more seriously. Anna alleged that Frankenstein drugged her by lacing her champagne, knocking her out with a heavy sedative, and then proceeded to forcibly cut off her genitalia. When she awoke, the external parts of her vagina had been forcibly removed with a... Anna alleged that Peter had been hanging out with other pretty questionable Satanists and witch doctors, implying that his motives may have been bizarrely religious or spiritual. This is when the police decided to descend upon the house and conduct an investigation into the alleged crimes. Peter would ultimately be arrested. It should be noted here that, as far as we know, Peter Frankenstein never killed anyone, but he did commit a morally repugnant series of sexual assaults, preying upon women he chose, including his own wife. When police searched his home, they discovered an array of horrifying, nightmarish things that would later be brought to trial and used against him. Things that further evidence to the depraved character. In his home, police found child pornography, surgical equipment, anesthesia, and illegal firearms. It was revealed first by his wife's account and then later by physical evidence that Frankenstein would use anesthesia to render his victims unconscious and totally helpless before using his surgical equipment to remove their genitalia. Remember those records mentioned above which show that the first began practicing forced mutilation in 2010? Well, those were his own records. Peter Frankenstein kept detailed accounts of each and every person whose genitalia he cut off, neatly and in his own handwriting. These records were kept in a form of a diary, much like many other twisted serial killers have kept their own form of records of their victims. Only Frankenstein didn't commit any murders. He did, however, have one entry titled Pedophilia Pig, where he discussed his rape and abuse of a girl who was only 9 years old. When Frankenstein went to trial for his crimes, the fact remained that Peter Frankenstein drugged his wife and rendered her unconscious before forcibly removing her genitalia. Police had detailed list of his sexual crimes in the form of his diary, including the mention of pedophilia practices, as well as sedating other women before removing their genitalia against their wishes. But how accurate was this diary? In a scene that was straight out of a Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, police found 21 bags filled with female genitalia, 21 bags containing clitorises and other parts of the vagina. Each bag was carefully marked and organized. They found another 2 clitorises drying on hooks in the garage of the home. It quickly became apparent that this was a crime scene, and that reports made by Anna was no joke. This man had actually been sedating and cutting up women for several years, and this dark and macabre tale was just beginning to unfold for both investigators and the world. It was after Frankenstein was arrested that things would really ramp up. In October of 2015, the prosecution's star witness, Anna Melissa was shot and killed assassination style outside her home in Listro. Also, she left her home shot rang out, and Anna was struck by 4 bullets. She would later die from her wounds in the hospital. Both wives were shot assassination style in 2 different locations. Authorities conducted an investigation. They were unable to immediately tie Peter Frankenstein to the murder, though everyone had their suspicion. but more would soon be revealed as Frankenstein stood trial and the prosecution mounted a formidable case against him with other witnesses besides Anna. After being arrested, Peter Frankenstein would be brought up on dozens of charges. His charges included pedophilia, 32 counts of possession of child pornography, manufacturing and distributing child pornography, the illegal removal of human tissue, causing grievous bodily harm, and even conspiracy to commit murder. Melissa McGraw was a man who was convicted of attempted murder and was serving an 11-year prison sentence at the same time. Richard Convitt would become witness for the prosecution on a latter charge when he claimed that Peter Frankenstein paid him $1,500 to arrange a hit on Anna. Frankenstein had also hoped that he would get out of the trial by postponing it as long as he could so that he could go undergo mental health evaluation that would rule him unfit to stand trial. The trial will be postponed for him to be evaluated, though Frankenstein was ultimately found capable of standing trial. A surviving victim also told Danish newspaper that she had been drugged by Peter with a sedative-laced alcohol cocktail and that she had woken with an atrocious headache and absolute agony. During the speculative process, Peter would give some unusual explanations for what was found inside his home. He mounted what could almost be referred to as the witchcraft defense, and actually claimed that the body parts in his freezer belonged to his wife and that she used them for pagan rituals. He even had the audacity to try and claim that he had told her several times to clean up the anesthesia, the surgical equipment, and the bags containing several vaginas in the freezer, but she simply wouldn't listen to him, though he had zero explanation for why he didn't take this information to the police. It was known that Peter himself was engaged in various unusual sorts of Satanism and ran with various unsavory crowds, and the men deflected all this onto his dead wife at trial. And what about all the charges of pedophilia and child pornography? His argument was yet again strikingly unusual. Frankenstein stated that he had no interest in child pornography, neither the possession of it nor the manufacturing of distributing of it, and was using it for research, noting that his efforts were almost complete what the research he was finding. So he was claiming he was doing research for some reason on child pornography. Okay, conviction. Women's rights groups poured out in protest, and activists all over the globe were enraged when they caught wind of this case. They sent threatening letters to Peter, with some of them remarking, "You will die as your wife died," and others death threats. He was warned not to obtain bail and to leave himself into jail, or he would be killed. The judge presiding over the case decided to drop 2 charges of rape pertaining to Anna, which would have been mighty hard to prove without the victim to give testimony. But ultimately, Peter would be found guilty on every charge that wasn't thrown out. Surprisingly, the charges pertaining to removing of human tissue were dropped, as the National Health Act was not clear on the punishment for such an action. However, it was the video interview with Peter Frankenstein had done with the Danish journalist which really sealed the deal, as in his own words on the video described how he drugged and rendered women unconscious and says removed their genitalia. He was found guilty of assaulting his dead wife Anna, which was possibly the most meaningful of all the convictions. Fredrickson was sentenced to 2 life terms for his crime. Oh, there's more. There's more. Unknown victims. What is the most shocking part of this story is that there are 20 pieces of vaginas which were found inside Peter Frankenstein's freezers that didn't belong to Anna. Who did they belong to? It seems that the police had a lot of work ahead of them. Investigators were initially sure many of the women's genitalia in the freezer belonged to in total, the first estimate pegging the number of 7 women. Frankenstein's diet helped to clarify the true extent of his horror crime. Some people suspect that he had more than over 21 victims where he removed their genitalia. And these victims to this day are unknown, whether they are living, deceased, or where they possibly are. This is still an open case, still an unsolved case, and it is a case that is in Denmark and in South Africa.
One of the most arduous examples of the unwanted release of a prisoner. His criminal life started in 1969 with crimes such as arson and burglary. His offenses earned him a 5-year sentence, but he was released earlier due to saving a prison guard in a riot. Shawcross returned to his life and married for a 3rd time, but over the next few months, Shawcross raped and killed 2 children before being sent back to prison upon confessing. After 12 years, inexperienced prison staff and social workers concluded that Shawcross was no longer dangerous, disregarding the warnings of a psychiatrist who had assessed Shawcross as a schizoid psychopath. A little did they know that his second release was also a second mistake. This monster went on a killing spree and killed a total of 11 people before finally getting locked up behind bars again.
People on the outside do not know what evil is.
Do you know what evil is?
Sure.
Are you evil?
Somewhat. I met Anne-Marie Steffens, I think, in front of the Finger Hut on Lake Avenue.
Do you remember killing her?
Yeah, possibly. I'm not going into details here.
No, but how did you kill her?
Probably strangulation.
How do you know when they're dead?
No. I don't know, just do. More or less after they just relax. Body relax, doesn't fight no more. It only takes about 4 minutes, probably.
4 minutes?
Sometimes less than that. She used to live in my house, or my apartment. For a while.
Was she a friend?
She was, until she started stealing stuff out of the house. I asked her, why you stealing? And she said, she needed money. And I said, you have a bank account. I was paying her $4.25 an hour just to clean the apartment.
So she was thieving from you?
She was taken from me and my wife, Rose.
Does that warrant killing her?
Huh?
Does that warrant killing her?
Well, to me it did.
After you killed her, you went back later to see the body. Is that right?
No, I went back to clean it up.
She was found with her head removed. Did you?
That's right.
How did that happen?
Easy. You just pick it up and move it.
What, you just pull the head off?
Yeah, it was already off. That was a fit of anger. You know, we spent a day down Turning Point Park, you know, feeding the ducks and walking around and we making out. Then she just flipped, you know, jumped up, says, I'm going to scream, I'm going to tell the cops. I snapped her neck. Stayed there all day until dark. Then, split her open. Her neck to her groin. I didn't go all the way deep into the stomach area, just split her open. I don't know why.
How did June Cicero die? How did you kill her?
Strangle her. mostly my left hand.
Well, so you strangled him with just one hand?
Right there. Pressure point.
Your mom has obviously denied that anything like that happened.
Everyone would. Can you picture what would happen to a person if she admitted she did shit like that to me?
I mean, they've said, Ascot, the Shawcross say, well, there was no sexual abuse when you were younger.
How they know? I know, because I was there. I know what I had to go through.
Well, they say they checked all the medical records.
I didn't have medical records when my mother was abusing me. You think my mother took me to a doctor because she was giving me oral sex? That's bullshit.
What happened in Vietnam?
Lots of things happened in Vietnam. Yeah, I went to Vietnam as a weapons specialist. And I had my own bunker and just outside of Con Tum, Vietnam, Central Highlands.
Shawcross claims he often ventured out into the jungle as a one-man unit, hunting down enemy Viet Cong.
And I see a woman in her 30s coming down this hill carrying 2 AKs on this side and 2 AKs on this side, barrel down. So I reach over my shoulder like this, right behind my neck, and I pull out a brand new machete. When she backed out, I come up behind her and took her head right there. It took a couple of hits, but the head came off. She body dropped to the ground, she just bled out. I split the body in half. Opened up a pouch and I had some C4, plastic explosives, lit a cigarette, just touched it and just started lit up like a miniature sun. And I just laid the flesh up on top of that stick, right? And I bit into the flesh itself, just staring at her eyes, and she urinated and defecated on herself. And she talked to me in broken English, so she told me everything I wanted to know. I go in, I reported in, saluted the colonel, and he gets up and he says, "You're one sick son of a bitch, but I love you."
There's a demon behind you. Next up is an interview which is said to be real. This time with a schizophrenic patient at an asylum in the USA back in 2008. There even was an exorcism performed on him, but sadly without any results. And the things he says to this interviewer, well...
So your official diagnosis is schizophrenic psychosis. Is that correct?
For the time being, yes.
For the time being? How do you mean?
Oh. My illness does not really fit, in any medical definition. Sorry.
Could you describe to us your illness and your symptoms?
I suffer from hallucinations. I see and feel and hear things that are not real.
Sorry, is that funny?
No.
What kind of medication are you getting?
Drugs. Antipsychotic drugs.
Do they help?
Yes.
So the medication makes the hallucinations go away?
No. But they help me decide what is real and not real. They help me understand that I don't have to obey and do everything they say.
When you say they, what exactly do you see?
Demons.
Even now? In here as we speak?
Yes.
Where?
Right there, right behind you.
Right behind me. Does he say anything?
Yes.
What does he say?
He tells me to hurt you. He wants me to hit you. He wants me to cut you. I'm tired now. I want you to go.
Well, just to recap, we have listened to actual audio from criminals describing their crimes. We have learned about the brutal cases from Ed Gein to a man who claims to see demons, and also cannibalism. Next week, we are definitely going to dive into more criminal behaviors, but we're actually going to touch on the psychology behind killers and the psychology behind the victims. We're also going to discuss a very famous, sometimes even romanticized, vicious killer, and her name is Cleopatra. You would not think that this woman who has a story, Anthony and Cleopatra, the great love story, that she was not a brutal killer. Well, we're definitely going to dive into those cases. With that, also we're going to dive into more cases, contemporary cases, also the psychology behind how people live with no conscience, no remorse, no sympathy. How do they not stop themselves from committing these horrendous crimes? Why do victims get sucked into it? Why do they stay? What is all those questions? How do we answer those questions? How do we understand what is going on behind closed doors? Well, we're going to try to answer those questions next week. So be sure to tune in for another episode of Betrayal on Armed Radio from 10 to 11 Eastern Time. And please be safe out there. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye now.